So we're delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture with Lynn Butler, The Horror Revival and What Scares Us Today. And we're thrilled to welcome Lynn back for her second lecture with us. Last summer, Lynn delivered an excellent lecture on fake news, which was really well received. And we were just saying, we can't believe how quickly the year has gone. My name is Paula Harrison and I'm the coordinator of University Centre Telford, and I'm hosting this evening. The centre is part of the University of Wolverhampton and is based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. We moved our public lecture programme online at the start of the pandemic last March, and it's been hugely successful, attracting people locally, nationally and globally. So before I hand over to Lynn, there's just a couple of housekeeping things to go through. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture via the Q&A button. And Lynn is also going to ask questions as she goes through as well. So if you could use the Q&A button rather than the chat button, and then I can just monitor that. If you're using a laptop or a desktop, the icon is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. And if you're using a mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. And just to remind you that Zoom is a public platform and the lecture is being recorded, so please don't share any personal information. So to introduce Lynn, Lynn has had a career in journalism spanning 2 decades. She started out as a print journalist with Trinity Mirror, which is now Reach PLC, but has most recently worked as a freelance multimedia journalist for the BBC, ITV, Free Radio and Birmingham Live. She's a journalism graduate, now teaching media and journalism within the university. So welcome, Lynn, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. Your introductions, as it always, so lovely. I always wonder if I'm going to actually live up to it. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and especially thanks for joining us because I know when we talk about what scares us today, I'm aware that Boris Johnson is about to speak now, which can in itself be quite a frightening thing. But if you've chosen this as the lesser of two evils, then thank you very much. I do appreciate it. So what I'm going to be looking at today is a string of recent critically acclaimed, I'd say, horror films. And I'm going to be using the work of some media theorists to examine why they're so frightening. What is it about these films that really gets to us, that stays with us? So some of the films I'm going to be looking at are Host, His House, St. Maud, Hereditary, Midsommar and Relic. Now, quite purposefully, I'm not using clips within the talk. The reason for this is, if you have seen these films, I want you to think about your memory of them, what it is you remember about these films, what it is that stayed with you. And for those of you who haven't seen all the films that are being discussed, I hope this will sort of prompt you to go away and take a look at those films. And if you have seen them, perhaps revisit them and think about what it is that's actually happening within those films, what it is that's affecting you and why and how. And also, I just want to thank you for being here, because being a horror fan isn't easy. I can't think of many other genres where people just go, I don't watch those. I don't watch those films. Being a horror fan is, as Mark Kermode said in a recent interview, it's an experience where you've probably had this strange sense of otherness that comes from loving a genre which from the outside can appear merely grotesque. And I think if you are here, you're probably aware that just as science fiction is about much more than science fiction, then horror is about a lot more than being horrified. But anyway, you won't be judged for being here, and thanks very much for coming along. So I just want to talk you through why I actually decided to put this research together and to kind of take a closer look at horror. And as we go along, you'll kind of hopefully see why I've called it the horror revival. So first of all, as a viewer, I just started to think about why some films made me afraid, why they stayed with me. And it wasn't the sort of jump shock elements of those films. There was something about certain films that made them really memorable, that made them stay with me. So what I did, I took a look at a couple of different types of theory, and there are 2 main theorists who are very accessible, don't be put off by the theory, very accessible, who examine horror, examine horror literature and horror films. And that is cultural. In other words, the way that horror the way that popular culture kind of seeps into our everyday lives and how we have an impact on it and how we perceive it. And then media theory, which maybe looks more at the kind of techniques and the different modes of writing. And I wanted to start off by showing you two quite different images. So picture on the left, these are some 1970s punks. And the picture on the right, and if anybody can guess what this film is, or put it into the chat in the next few seconds, well done, 10 out of 10. I'd give you a prize if there were any. This is a film called, a 1971 film called The Horrible Sexy Vampire. And if you've seen it, well done. And the reason that I've picked these two, what might look on the face of it, very different images, is because the way that punk used to be seen and the way that horror used to be seen are very similar. And the first theorist that I'm going to look at, he was one of the first people to look at horror in a particular way and for it to have cultural kind of resonance. So the first theorist that we're going to look at is Andrew Tudor. So he looked at horror as a cultural form. He looked at horror as being culturally important, how it's historically important, how horror can reflect changes in society, and also how, as we change, we perceive it differently. We see it in different contexts, and you'll see that, I think, as I move through the lecture. But he saw it as being important and relevant, just as a theorist, actually, who used to work at the University of Wolverhampton called Dick Hebdige, he did exactly the same thing with punk and with other subcultural movements. He said, you know, this is more than spiky hair and ripped jeans. This is important. It represents something within a historical context and within society. And that's what Andrew Tudor did with horror. It's quite rare for a theorist to take horror seriously. And as a horror fan, you're probably aware of that horror is not taken seriously. And that's what he did. So what he did was he published a book in 1989 called Monsters and Mad Scientists, A Cultural History of the Horror Movie. So then again, he's very much kind of placing it in a cultural and historical setting. So he looked at every single film that had been released in Britain that he classed as a horror film. So it included some science fiction and some kind of psychological horror. So every single film that was released in Britain between 1931 and 1984, so it was nearly 1,000 films. And what he did was he took this really systematic approach. And if you look at his fantastic book, which is still in print now, he's got like the top 10 horror monsters, the top 10 threats, pursuers, narratives. So he kind of systematically analysed all of these films. And then he drew out patterns of development and how these changed over time, how there were sort of different fashions within horror, how this reflected society. And kind of four of the main eras that he pulled out were the sort of 50s boom, where he says here 139 horror films were made in this kind of 5-year period. And there was a decline, which I think there was a shift to more realism. So horror kind of and fantasy sort of fell out of favour. Then there was the 70s boom, I think became cheaper to make films. So you've got a lot of the so-called sort of video nasties, a lot of cheaper horror. It was cheaper to produce it. And then he goes into this final phase in his book, because his book ends in kind of 83, 84, this kind of sustained growth with the emergence of VHS. Horror films are more accessible. These kind of films that aren't necessarily getting a theatrical release, there are more people are able to view them. But for the first part of the lecture, what I want to focus on is the 50s boom, which he calls phase 3. And phase 4, the 70s boom. Actually, that's phase 5, isn't it? I'm no good at Roman numerals. And so the first thing that I want to ask you when I look at this first part of why horror films are frightening these days is, who are the heroes of the horror genre? I don't know if you just wanted to put into the Q&A, if you've got any idea who you think Andrew Tudor defines after he's looked at all of these films, nearly 1,000 films. He identifies a distinct group of people, a distinct character in the horror film as the hero. I just wondered if you had any idea who that might be, what character it might be that would be the hero. So Paula, if you could let me know if when you get some responses.
From Natalie, we've got Final Girl.
Ah.
From John, The Monster or Baddie. We've got The Professor or Academic, for example, Van Helsing.
Yeah.
And that comes up a couple of times from Jonathan.
Oh, that's really interesting. So thanks very much for those.
Any survivors as well from
absolutely, which is sometimes rare.
And then Final Girls and Monsters from Rebecca.
Excellent, thanks Rebecca. So we'll give you a clue, and his name's already come up a couple of times. So here we've got Peter Cushing as Dr. Van Helsing in the 1958 Hammer film, The Horror of Dracula, where I think Christopher Lee was Dracula. And yeah, absolutely, Van Helsing is an example of this type of character, which is the expert. So Tudor's hero is the expert, and they first emerge in the 1950s. So he describes them as the decade's defenders against invaders. They are the people who've got this kind of specialist knowledge. They are completely trustworthy. They're heroic, but in a different way to a normal hero. They're very different to a normal hero. So for example, you've got Quatermass. Quatermass is probably, you know, one of the kind of the staples when we think about the sort of 50s, 60s heroic expert. So we can see him here played by Brian Donlevy in the Quatermass Experiment. So he's kind of heroic, and in some senses he's kind of very traditional, but then you also see him battling against the authorities, trying to convince them, trying to use his knowledge to, in this case, kind of protect the world from invasion. And as Tudor says, these kind of characters, these experts, they're rarely given this same kind of heroic persona in other films. So for instance, you've got Andre Morel, who also portrayed sort of Quatermass, and he's almost given a kind of romantic kind of character here, but you really don't see that in many other films, the role of the expert. But I think what this expert did, the presence of this expert, whenever there's an expert, you've always got this sense of coziness, the kind of cozy horror. They've got this specialist knowledge, you know they're there, you know they're going to protect you, you know they're going to solve the problem in the end. And if we kind of leap forward a little bit, it makes me think of things like Poltergeist, films like Poltergeist, where the family are in trouble, they've got an invasion, however, they're almost overrun with experts. You've got the group of parapsychologists that come in at first with all of their technology, all of their different devices. Then you've got the spirit medium who comes in, and she's got very specialist knowledge. She tells them about this presence called the Beast, who is after their young daughter's soul. So you've got this very specialist knowledge. They're really trustworthy. You kind of know that everything is going to be okay. And you also see this in more recent films as well, especially horror films that are kind of considered nostalgic, I think. So films like The Conjuring and Insidious. So you've got the portrayal of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were sort of real life ghost hunters who you see in these films. But they've got this knowledge. They will protect us. They will keep us safe. And Tudor here, he's talking about really experts kind of from the 50s onwards. And he talks about this idea of, which I think is taken from H.P. Lovecraft, this idea of the lurker at the threshold. For all its power, always had the door slammed in its face. Expertise, faith, and self-discipline combined to provide a foundation against which vampire and ghost, zombie and ghoul was helpless. So I think whenever you watch any of these types of films, there's a coziness about the horror. You don't get this sense of real fear, I don't think. And when I thought about the shift that had happened with regard to the expert, I thought of Paranormal Activity, which I know, yes, is very well known for its kind of jump scares, and the fact that it's probably the most kind of commercially successful film ever made, just because it was made for such a small amount of money and took such a huge amount of money. But there was something that really stuck with me in this film, and I was trying to think about what the unsettling nature of this film was, because in theory it's got a lot of things in common with Poltergeist and with other kind of haunted house films that what might fit into that cozy category. And it was something that Peter Bradshaw said in his review that kind of got me thinking when I was looking back on that, which is this drama skips genre cliches. And I was thinking, what does it not have? What is not there? And then I thought about the scenes with the expert. So there is an expert in paranormal activity who's called on kind of quite early on because all of these things are starting to happen in the house. It's almost like the same way you'd call in a plumber. You know, we've got a leak, we'll call in a plumber, we'll get someone to sort this out, because we just expect that, don't we? We expect the expert to come and help us out generally. So Mark Fredericks, he plays Dr. Fredericks. So he kind of comes into the house. He looks like your typical expert. He's got a clipboard, you know, what he couldn't be any more of an expert. He kind of describes to them, this is the kind of haunting you've got. It's actually demonic. I can't help you, but I've got a colleague who can. You can email him. And for a while, there's this sense of kind of, as Bradshaw says here, this kind of sense of calm. And I don't know if you recall what happens when things escalate and he comes back. So he comes back to the house, but it's literally for a couple of minutes. And he says, I can't help you. This isn't my area. I can't be here. And we see the faces. We see, you know, we see their faces, and we're just, it's like, you're an expert. You can't leave us. You can't abandon us. But here we've got this expert as powerless, as unwilling to help. And for me, this is kind of the opposite of that cozy horror. The opposite of there is going to be someone to save us. And thinking back on that film, it's something that really stayed with me. So then Tudor goes on to talk about horror in the 70s and 80s. And this is what brings me on really to, firstly, to the idea of the horror revival, because I think some of the films that I'm going to go on to talk about now, a bit like Paranormal Activity, they kind of echo what was happening in the 70s and 80s, in that the defences are disappearing. As Tudor says here, the defences protecting this world from the other have long since disappeared. Van Helsing is in his grave. The old remedies don't work. The lurker has crossed the threshold, which definitely happens in Paranormal Activity, and they're kind of powerless to stop it. And this was very much the case in the 1970s as well. I'm not really going to go too deeply into kind of politics. We've got to think about a change in the way that experts were believed, the way that authority was trusted, how that shifted from the 50s through the 60s through the 70s. And perhaps that's what we're seeing again now. Because I think about experts like Donald Pleasance in Halloween. He's kind of impotent. He's kind of passive. He's in the film, but he doesn't solve anything. Yes, he shoots Michael Myers, but it doesn't really have an effect because he goes on to like 100 sequels. But he's not the hero anymore as he would have been in the 50s. We also see this in The Omen, I think, is really clear, where you've got all of these different levels of expert and it just doesn't work. So, for example, you've got Gregory Peck as the diplomat, you know, representing authority of government. You've got David Warner as the photographer, the journalist, but they're ineffective. There's nothing they can do to stop what's happening. And probably the ultimate of this as well is Patrick Troughton, who has a quite untimely demise, which is one of those probably gory moments that stuck with me for a long time. You know, the church can't help you, the journalist can't help you, the government can't help you. All of these kind of experts are powerless. And Tudor goes on to discuss these 70s experts, saying they're helpless, except you might see these optimistic variations like Poltergeist. And then we're kind of in a world, I think we can very much apply this to today, a world in which everything we consider most secure can no longer be trusted. And he goes on to talk about we can't trust technology. I'm sure if he was writing today, he'd be talking about mobile phones and he'd be talking about laptops. And it brings me on to the next film, which is Host, and which I hope everyone has been able to watch, because I thought it was an absolutely fantastic film. Not only a fantastic film in that it was made during lockdown, and how was that achieved? That's extraordinary, but also that it reflected the really real experiences of people through lockdown, and I think was a very effective horror because of that. And that made me think of about what Tudor says. how about this apparatus of suburban life can be imbued with supernatural malevolence. We can no longer trust these things, and we see that in Host. So just thinking about the film, initially technology is a good thing. It's bringing these friends together. It's light-hearted. We recognise this. We recognise this setup. We recognise what we're looking at. We've been living through this. So we've got these friends all together having a seance. And they're joined initially by an expert, Seylan. She tells them what to do if things go wrong. So she's very much there in a kind of protector sort of role. She has this specialist knowledge. She's a guide. She's a very traditional kind of expert character, really. She also kind of looks and sounds quite different to everyone else. She's taking things very seriously. Even her house looks, they joke about how spooky her house looks. She disappears at one point because she's getting a delivery. So they're kind of left alone without her. And even at that point, the atmosphere kind of changes. So they come to rely on her quite quickly. And then we see the mood change when Seylan doesn't really leave, but when her connection is lost. And then having played a joke with the spirits and then conjuring up a real spirit, we then see that, first of all, the technology becomes unreliable, but then it becomes diabolical. It's kind of imbued with this demon that then can then affect them. And the expert isn't there. They can't get hold of her. They can't get hold of her on the phone. They can't reconnect with her. There's no one to save them. And we see, the diabolical nature of what's coming to get them. We see it kind of invading their screens and their homes. So Tudor says about the 1970s horror: houses, cars, trees, television sets, all the routine apparatus of suburban life can be unpredictably imbued with supernatural malevolence, and we're powerless to stop that. And going on to think about this idea of supernatural malevolence, I also want to think about Hereditary. I'm sure those of you who've seen Hereditary will agree that it's an extremely memorable and frightening film. But on many levels, there's so much going on with this film. And I was starting to think about why it was that it had stuck with me in the same way that some of these other films had. Because in some ways, the setup is quite similar to the kind of poltergeist idea. You've got a family, strange things are starting to happen to them. But why isn't it poltergeist? Why doesn't it feel like poltergeist? And for me, what hit me, struck me, probably the second time that I watched it, why I'd got this sense of kind of dread and why I felt so unsettled is there's no expert in Hereditary. There's no one to save them. There's nobody. They're completely isolated in these experiences that they're having, and kind of completely isolated from each other. And we're kind of passive in watching that. We're kind of passive in watching their kind of sealed fate almost as we watch the film. And then when we do see someone who we hope is an expert, it turns out that she's the complete opposite of what an expert should be. She's actually in league. She's part of this kind of demonic, doomed process that the family are going through. But I think even when you're watching the film, even though you've got suspicions about her, initially you just kind of really, really hoping that she is going to help them. She seems to have this kind of specialist knowledge. It seems like she wants to support the family, but quite quickly we realise that that's not her role in the film. And watching it again, something here that I noticed on this slide here is that even when Joan, who befriends Annie, the mum in the family, when she befriends her and says how she talks to her son through a chalkboard, and that she might be able to do the same and talk to her daughter who's recently been killed. If we actually look in the back of the car on the left-hand side there, we actually see that she's just bought the chalkboards, that it's all lies. And it's one of those films where you go back and watch it. I wonder if I even took that in when I was watching the film first and didn't realise and started to have this uneasy feeling. But then we slowly realised that they're kind of pawns. As Bittel here in this review of the film says, there's this uneasy sense right from the start that they're the playthings, like the doll in Charlie, the daughter, like the dolls in her collection. And in fact, when we very opening scene of the film, we see them within a doll's house. we see that their fate is sealed because they're just playthings. And to me, this is like all adds up to being the opposite of this cozy narrative. And that's what gives us, I think, this lack of expert, this lack of support, what gives us certainly this eerie feeling. And that brings me on to the second part of what I want to talk about tonight. And I just want you to take a look at this image, which is of the Easter Island heads. And maybe just jot down in the chat or in the Q&A what kind of feelings you get when you look at those Easter Island heads. What kind of words spring to mind when you think about them? When you think about what they're for, who built them, who made them? What kind of sense do you get when you look at them? What kind of words spring to mind? Apart from hopefully I don't resemble one too much at the moment.
Andrew says ancient and primitive. Rebecca, ancient, cult, folk, earth. Amanda says, hold on, protector. Sorry, there's another one in the way. Ancestor. And then Jacqueline says, I think of what is buried and what you cannot see.
Ah, interesting.
Folklore, ancient rituals from John. Dawn says wisdom. And daunting from Jonathan.
Excellent. That's really good because none of you used the word that I'm going to talk about, but everything that you have talked about links to that. So that's great. Thank you very much.
Somebody says, what are they protecting?
I think I've also seen cartoons of them when under the ground, you can kind of see them with their arms crossed and they're kind of with their legs crossed and things. It's almost like what's under the ground as well, which is quite interesting, I think. So thank you for that. And thanks, Paula. So the other theorist that I'm going to talk about, and which hopefully we'll see how it links to those Easter Island heads, is a theorist and a sort of media and literary critic called Mark Fisher. And Mark Fisher wrote in 2016 a book called The Weird and the Eerie. And I was really fascinated when I read this book because for some reason, all of the films I liked were in this book. I didn't realise anyone else liked exactly the same films that I did. I never realised that they were kind of grouped together, and because I was never really sure why they were grouped together and what it was about those films that drew me to them and what linked them. And what Mark Fisher does in this book is he examines what he calls modes. He examines what the weird is and what the eerie is, and kind of argues that they're really closely related, but they're distinct things. And then he examines the effect of the weird and the eerie on us and what makes them so unsettling. And he looks at film, but also at literature. So he looks at the work of H.P. Lovecraft, M.R. James, Daphne du Maurier, and Nigel Neal, the writer of Quatermass. And firstly, he looks at the weird. And he says the weird is the kind of sensation of wrongness. And the way that he sums it up is the weird is something that shouldn't be there. It doesn't exist. It shouldn't exist in our world. It's strange. It's kind of, you think about H.P. Lovecraft, kind of weird tentacled kind of monsters. But he also talks a lot about the work of David Lynch, where there are curtains where there shouldn't be curtains, where there are things where there shouldn't be things. For instance, in one of his latest films, What Did Jack Do? There's a talking monkey. There are just these things that don't belong. But actually the eerie is what I really want to talk about. And I think the eerie is really relevant when we think about this sense of fear and the way that things can make us feel unsettled. He says, rather than with the weird, where it's just something that shouldn't be there, the eerie is constituted by a failure of absence or a failure of presence. And what he means by that is that sometimes there are things that are present when there shouldn't be anything. And sometimes there's nothing there when there should be something. I really love that. I really love that idea, and I'll kind of show you how that feeds into some horror. I'm just aware that I'm probably running over already, but I'll keep going. And Fisher, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Freud. Freud wrote an essay called The Uncanny, or Unheimlich, das Unheimlich, which kind of translates as unhomely or uncanny. And it kind of relates to something that is kind of familiar or old established, but we've become alienated from it. So to us, it seems strange and unknowable, even though it's something that we've really just repressed and has always been there. And I always think of the uncanny is interesting because we have the word canny, don't we, which means kind of having special knowledge of something. And this is almost having knowledge of something we've forgotten about, something that's familiar but strange. So this is what we're going to talk about, the eerie, which, as Jones describes it, is when the strange and the familiar meet. And the example that Mark Fisher gives as a sort of the generic case of the eerie is the birds. He talks more about the book, the short story, The Birds by Daphne du Maurier, but also it does relate to the film. And I love the way that he uses the birds in order to sum up what he means by the eerie. So the birds have ceased to become a part of the natural background. For instance, here this evening, you might be able to hear there's birds outside. They're part of the background. That's where they should be. In the birds, they suddenly come to the foreground. They've got a purpose. We don't know what that purpose is. They have agency. This, Mark Fisher says, is really important when we talk about the eerie. Things that shouldn't have agency or purpose suddenly do, but we don't know why. So in the birds, we've got the presence of these birds. They've come from the background to the foreground. There's suddenly this presence. They're acting out something, or they're exerting power. And that can be animals, or it can be fate itself, which I think we see also in Hereditary. And I also think this is reflected in, or illustrated really well in a film called First and Last Men, which was directed by Johan Johansson and narrated by Tilda Swinton. And I do recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's based on a book by William Olaf Stapledon, which was written in 1930, and it's about humanity's final evolution, billions of years in the future. And the film is just illustrated with these extraordinary images, which I would say are eerie, because they illustrate that man has left the earth. He's left the structures behind. What's really interesting is that these are actually socialist era monuments in former Yugoslavia. So these are real monuments, but they've got this kind of eeriness attached to them. So you can kind of imprint on that what happened to the people that made these? Where have they gone? There's an absence in that we don't know who made them or why they made them. We think about, Mark Fisher's talking about another film, but he talks about what happened to produce these ruins, this disappearance. So we know something made them, but we don't know why. And we don't know what the agency was. We don't know if they made them for good or for evil. And they're absolutely fantastic images. That brings me on to talk about Midsommar. And now Fisher initially argues that we find the eerie more readily in landscapes. And I think we see that in Midsommar. We think about the village. Even though the village is populated, we get a sense of the eerie through not knowing who built them. Why have they been built? Why are they so strangely sort of proportioned? Why are they here? We've got these very strange proportions that we see in the buildings. No one questions this. No one kind of goes, wow, these buildings are really strange. You know, they just are. So there's a sense of the eerie in that we don't know who built them or why they built them. And I think that's very unsettling, very eerie. And there's this also, I think, an added sense of eeriness in Midsommar through fate, and fate appearing to have agency. fate appearing to have a plan, because we see this picture at the very start, this illustration at the very start of the film, where we see the whole film unfolding. Now, so far what we've seen has been outdoors, and Mark Fisher argues really that eeriness only really exists outdoors, because we find the eerie more readily in landscapes partially emptied of the human. So for instance here, gravestones, kind of a desolate beach. These are images from Jonathan Miller's 1966 adaptation of M.R. James' A Whistler Come to You. So I think you can look at these now and see this sense of the eerie. But actually, I'll argue against that. I actually think in a lot of the films that I've looked at, and here's a still here from his house, the home actually becomes the landscape of the eerie, and the houses and the families themselves are kind of the ruined or abandoned structures that Fisher says is really key to eeriness. And in fact, with Hereditary, I'd actually say the interior of the house becomes like a landscape. The house is framed or filmed like a landscape. The miniatures that Annie works on are filmed like landscapes. They're filmed as though they're real houses within the setting of the house. And also the house almost becomes one with the setting as well, with the exterior and the interior become one, allowing for this sense of eeriness to seep from the outside inside. And I think we see this in Remy Weeks' His House. And here Kim Newman in his review says that this kind of, it inhabits different spaces, and I think it physically and psychologically inhabits different spaces too. So he talks about this drab kind of kitchen sink look that the film has, and then this netherworld. So on the surface we see perhaps a sense of the eerie through the fact that these estates were probably once built to be the future, to be a bright, prosperous future, and have now kind of been abandoned. And the couple are coming into it and finding these kind of abandoned homes. But then we actually see that when they're inside the house actually then seems to be floating within their kind of memories of trauma that they've been through. So you've got the exterior coming into the interior, a combination of the two. And I'll come back to this idea about agency, the idea about what is the purpose of something. And I think in His House, we've got this idea here that Fisher talks about, this failure of absence. Are we being watched by an entity that has not quite revealed itself? And I think we see that in His House. I think even at the end, I won't spoil the ending if you haven't seen it, at the end when we see perhaps what we could describe as a manifestation of the eerie, we don't know what the agency is behind that, if it's good or evil, what it means for the couple in the film. And I just wanted to think about why Fisher argues that it's important we think about the eerie. You could think, well, the weird and the eerie, why write a book about that? You know, how is that important in my life? But Mark Fisher argues that because the eerie is about agency, it is about the forces that govern our lives, that govern the world. And perhaps that's why these films are so unsettling, because we know that there are forces that we can't see that control us. So I think that's really, really important to think about eeriness. And I wanted to think about the eerie and family. What Mark Fisher says is actually the absence of something can be more haunting than an apparition itself. And I think we see that in a couple of the films that I've talked, one film I have talked about already, and another film, Relic, Australian film by Natalie Erica James, where the family matriarch goes missing. Her daughter and granddaughter come home to find her, and they find this kind of presence hanging over the house. And I've got this idea of the mother as other, which I'll kind of explore. And when I was watching this film, there was just a sense to it, a sense of eeriness and strangeness. Even with looking at Robin Nevin, who plays Edna, the mum in this film, or the grandmother, I couldn't work out what it was, what this sense was that I was finding so disturbing. I think for a start, there's the idea that she's present in a way that she shouldn't be, because when she's been missing and she returns, she's different, she's changed. But she's also missing in another way because she has dementia. So she's present in a really strange way, and then she's absent in a way that she should be there. And we see the sort of frustration for Emily Mortimer, the character of her daughter. And there was also this the same sense of strangeness, I think, with Hereditary. When we think about her mother, Ellen, and we think about a very strange scene at the start, a very eerie scene where we see Ellen, or where Annie sees Ellen in the corner of the room. It's a very frightening moment, I think. I've actually lightened the picture so you can kind of just see her. But she's kind of absent in a way that she should be there. She's absent as a mother. She's also absent as a moving image. All the images we see of her are still. So the house itself seems eerie because of her absence, and we sense that she's had such an effect on the house. But then she's present in strange ways as an apparition. And then she's also present as a kind of an empty vessel. She's present in her coffin. And then also in a photograph, which actually that photograph, she looks exactly the same as she does in the kind of apparition scene in the film. She's wearing exactly the same clothes. So she's kind of present in this very strange way. And I'm struggling to explain this because I struggled to work out what I was feeling and why I was feeling this strangeness around the idea of absent and present mothers. And then I looked at the work of Julia Krasiva, who wrote a book called Powers of Horror. And this is about objection, about something being cast off. She talks about a mother's body as being something that we're drawn to and kind of repelled by. So we have to separate from our mothers in order to sort of survive. But then we want to return or stay in the womb because it's safe. But we know that if we return to the womb, that we'll die, that we'll be absorbed back into the mother. And this is kind of Julia Krasiva's argument. And I think it spoke to me on a very sort of deep level. And then also there's something quite visceral in these films, something that also feeds into something that she argues about, which is the idea of sticky and oozing substances are horrifying to us at a really deep level because they suggest this desire to return to the womb. Stick with me, it will make sense in a moment, I promise. We've got this, we kind of feel like we want to return to the womb, so we want to stay away from these sticky oozing things that remind us of the womb. But we also know it's impossible to return to the womb as well. So if we think about both Hereditary and Relic, there's a sense, isn't there, of decay, of oozing, of substances, of like blackness, of rot and mold. Also with Relic, we've got this kind of recurring sort of use of this image of the window, where we actually see the exterior becoming the interior. So I think that's also a place for eeriness to kind of grow as well. But in Relic, we see, you know, the rot and the decay is kind of coming through the walls. And then as Edna kind of deteriorates, we see her actually physically deteriorate as she's still living. We see her kind of rotting. And then thinking about Hereditary, when we go up into the loft, we go up into the attic and we discover what's in the attic. It's kind of the rotting body of the mother who's been exhumed. Again, we've got this like disgust and this horror, and I think it taps into something really primal when we think about eeriness and the mother in the ways in which they're absent when they shouldn't be and present when they shouldn't be. And I just wanted to move on to a slightly different, just to finish, a slightly different idea of the eerie. And I want to think about a film that I'd watched really recently. I know Strange Times, that Maud actually was originally Originally came out in 2019, but because we're living in strange times, it's probably not till this year that most people have been able to watch it. And I found this film had a really profound effect on me, in that I watched it and I was frightened, and I didn't know what I was frightened of, and I didn't know why I was frightened. And I looked again at Mark Fisher's work, and I thought about something that he said, which is the quickest way to produce a sense of the eerie is to restrict information. And I think St. Maud is a lot about limiting our view, limiting views of what's happening. And I thought about the incredible performance by Morfydd Clark, and also by Jennifer Ale as well as her patient. So we've got Maud as a nurse who's caring for a terminally ill dancer, Maud who's become devoted to kind of religion and to saving Amanda, the dancer's soul. But there's so much in Morfydd Clark's performance, but there's also so much in the film that we don't see. We don't see the world the way she sees it. We're not in her world. When she's standing at her altar, we don't see what she sees. And this creates what Mark Fisher calls is a sense of alterity. And alterity is like extreme otherness. It's something that we can't even imagine experiencing. So the ultimate would be death. We can't experience it. We can't know what it's like. And that's something I think that comes across in this film. This is what Maud is going through. That's why it's so unsettling. We can't experience what she's experiencing. For example, when she kind of levitates, when she seems to be possessed, she becomes something completely other. We can't imagine or know what she's experiencing. Is she even Maud? Is she Katie? What is she? We don't know. And then we kind of compare that with Amanda, who wants to, through all her trauma, remain exactly the same person, even though she's dying. And that's very difficult for Maud, who we find out has kind of been involved in some sort of traumatic event in hospital. And I think this is what's so frightening, is that when we find out a little bit more, we're given pieces of information, but actually what's added are gaps in the viewer's knowledge. Now here Mark Fisher is talking about Under the Skin, a book and film, and he's also talking about a book called Surfacing by Margaret Atwood, but I think it applies to St. Maud as well. The question, what happened, and the ultimate lack of a resolution to a mystery means that eerie atmosphere is never dissipated, and I think you get that with St. Maud. Is it real? What happened to her? Why isn't she called Katie anymore? What happened when she was trying to save this patient? We never know. So we get these little glimpses, but all they create for us are gaps. I think what's really interesting as well, is the final slide really, on St. Maud, is the fact that when you watch this film, do we think she's really experiencing these things that we're kind of almost privy to, but not? And I wonder about this scene where we see her with her wings, because actually she's got her back away from the wings and we can still see them. So is this a clue to us, actually, that everything she's been experiencing has been real? I thought that was just a really interesting scene in the film. And I can see I've run over, and I'm hoping we can stay a bit longer if there's loads of questions. But that's it, really. I just wanted to end, really. I just wanted to go back to Andrew Tudor and something that he wrote about 1970s cinema, which I think applies now, which is why I kind of call it this kind of future past for horror, where he writes, it's as if we've been cast loose in a world for which we no longer have reliable maps, in which once clear landmarks are not what they seem, and in which we know we must seek new shelter or perish. So we've got this lack of expert, this lack of trust, the sense that we've all got to fend for ourselves, and this sense of the eerie. And I think in modern horror, and perhaps beyond horror, that kind of reflects where we are now, which is why I think we're in this horror revival. And thank you very much. And I hope we've got time for some questions. And I'm sorry, Paula.
That's fine. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Lynn. That was brilliant. And lots of comments. And things that I missed as well, which I just want to go back to.
Oh, okay, yeah, that'd be great, thank you.
Because I don't want to miss the fact that Helen Curran did use the word eerie and unnerving. So, and I only saw that afterwards. So well done to Helen.
Well done, Helen Curran.
Yes. So that was that. And then there were a couple of comments. I'll just go back to the chat as well, which I missed, which were answers to your first question. I think it was Jacqueline McQuaid said that some political heads try to paint experts as the villain today.
Yeah, I think that is reflected in the, you know, I think that probably is a political statement now when you see some of these films, so that there is a lack of expert, or that they're just kind of passive, or they're ignored. Yeah.
And then there were others, I think. Oh yes, Theatre Centre said that heroes were everyday people. Emily said the final nearly victim. There were a couple that I missed earlier.
The experts can be ordinary people, and they can be kind of the last people standing as well. So absolutely, yeah. I think the fact that experts can be normal people, I think, is important.
Yes. And right at the beginning, Emma Dornan asked, will the recording be available to watch? I did post in the chat that yes, it will be. It will be on University Centre Telford YouTube channel. But if you give us a couple of weeks to edit it and upload. And then Rebecca McCallum, she said a question for a little later if possible. I'm assistant editor of Ghouls magazine. Fantastic, an online site that looks at horror through the female perspective. I think about the films mentioned, Hereditary, Midsommar, The Invisible Man. These are memorable to me because they are empowering in some form, comforting. And I wondered if in your research, Lynn, there were any themes that came up around the comforting nature of horror films.
Oh, do you know what? No, it's not something that I think I thought about the cozy nature of the horror films, especially when it came to the expert and perhaps a lack of the sense of the eerie. There was that coziness, I think. There were some films you can just watch and just know everything's going to turn out all right in the end. But no, that's really interesting, because I think specifically, I think in even in Hereditary, you know, the mother does leave the daughter a note, you know, suggesting that she does really care about her. And I think in Relic also, I think there is a lot of tenderness between the sort of female characters. So that's really interesting. That's not really something I thought about.
Something to explore.
Definitely, absolutely.
And then Jonathan says that you've made some really good points, really detailed lecture. The examples and case studies mentioned are predominantly British, American, Australian. Would Lynn be interested to explore if there are similar trends and representations in non-English language? Or have you considered this already?
No, not really. I think I just decided to sort of focus on a core of films that I'd seen recently that had kind of brought up these feelings. But I know I've definitely felt the same way watching kind of Japanese horror and kind of Spanish, and so that's probably just me not being very diverse, and I apologize. But no, definitely, I think, and it'd be interesting to see if there are, because we've seen some cultures, the kind of the mother figure, or, you know, that the family dynamics might be different. It would be interesting to see how that kind of impacts on the things I've talked about. So that's definitely something I would explore as well.
Yeah, so that would be another talk, Lynn.
Yes, I've got like 2 other talks so far.
That's right, definitely. Andrew says, fantastic talk, really enjoyed it, and we'll watch some of those films. He has a question: do you think audiences prefer not seeing the monster anymore, that is Freddy Krueger, Pennywise, and prefer psychological horror like Hereditary and Relic, etc.?
I just don't think the monster is frightening anymore. I think because of so much of what we're frightened of in real life are things that we don't see, the way that we're controlled, or surveillance and things like that. I just think it's very difficult to create something that physically that is really frightening beyond a sort of jump scare, you know, beyond a sort of momentary kind of shock. So yeah, I just don't think monsters are. I'm sure if Andrew Tudor was to kind of continue his research now and kind of bring it up to date, he'd probably find that monsters were probably right down the bottom of the list, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. An anonymous attendee says, Ari Aster shows us the whole story of Midsommar at the beginning of the film, tapestry, and similarly with the doll's house at the start of Hereditary. Do you think this hint at the fate of the characters in the film?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think fate, you know, Mark Fisher, when he talks about agency and the eeriness, he talks about fate and how eerie it can be when you've got an idea that that's something that shouldn't have agency, like just what's going to happen when that is present. Yeah, and Ari Aster gives very clear indications of that, I think, in both films, especially in Midsommar, where you've got the whole film laid out in front of you, but strangely, when you see that, because it's the very sort of opening scene of the film, you don't really take it in. You don't, or not on a kind of not on a conscious level. You don't take in that you're being shown all of the kind of major scenes of the film. So I think that's really fascinating.
Thank you. John says he's always thought of horror as an offshoot of surrealism, and dream logic, plus following subtext that allows us to look into our relationship with our fears of our existence and death.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways horror just allows sort of directors and writers to do much more than they would do in any other sort of genre. I'm sure there's some directors who, I don't know, Ari Aster, I don't know if Ari Aster, director of Midsommar and Hereditary, if he's kind of continuing in the horror theme, or if horror just allows him to kind of experiment in ways that you wouldn't be able to do in other genres, like thrillers or action films or kind of romantic films, because it just gives you that opportunity to kind of explore people's interior worlds, doesn't it, and people's fears. Yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay, Jonathan says he would recommend Raw. And he says, thank you for your answer, as does Andrew. So that's good. Jacqueline says fate creates a feeling of helplessness.
Yeah, in fact, I think there's a scene in the classroom in Hereditary where they're discussing fate. I can't remember what book they're reading or what text they're looking at, but there's a debate around, is it better to know? Is it better to have a choice, or is it better for your fate to be fixed? But I'm not sure what text they're looking at. There's some stuff on the blackboard, but again, it's one of those films where you have to just keep going back and you notice all these little things. So fate is very much a part of that film. Yeah.
Brilliant. And then Xavier says, thanks for such an interesting and accessible lecture. I really like the idea of how contemporary horror is looking back to some of those earlier traditions through a loss of faith in experts and authority figures. And then Natalie Martin would like to know what film you'll be watching next.
I don't know, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Something like that. There's a film called Sator, I think, which I've heard is very good. I've just saw that come up on, I think it's on Amazon Prime. I think it's on there from allowed to advertise them. It's a film called Sator, Sator. I don't know much about the director. I know, similar to Relic, and I think a couple of other recent horror films or psychological horror films, it involves a character with dementia and a kind of demonic presence or force that could be imaginary or real. So that's a film I'm very interested in watching.
Okay, and then just a couple of comments. Interior eerie is true in Vivarium as well.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah.
And Julia Montoya, loved this, greetings from California.
Oh, hello, hi.
And Natalie Martin says, thank you very much, really enjoyed this evening's lecture. And then just time for a couple more comments. Julia Montoya from America says she'd love to hear a lecture on, is it POC in horror? POC in horror?
Oh, I don't know what that is.
So you might have to explain that to us.
No, that's another lecture I'll have to think about.
And then Jacqueline, The Taking of Deborah Logan.
That was the one, yeah, Taking of Deborah Logan, yeah.
Sorry, I should have known that. So she'd love to hear a lecture on people of colour in horror. So I think you've got about 3 or 4 talks there, Lynn. So one last question then from Phil. Does the lack of monsters and heroes in post-Cold War horror reflect a more inward take on horror?
Definitely, yeah. And that idea of that we're all more kind of individualized as well, and that we're all kind of, I think this is idea with that sort of goes along with capitalism, that we should all be kind of suffering and that we all have to sort of fend for ourselves. And I think it kind of goes kind of hand in hand with that, really, and this kind of increase in the popularity of what you could call psychological horror, where, you know, the threat is kind of, it comes from the inside, I suppose. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Lynn. That was absolutely fascinating and lots of engagement.
Are you going to watch, because Paula told me she doesn't like horror films at all. Have I made you want to watch any of them?
I'm not sure. As I said, I'm scared of everything. So I'm not sure. I might do. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your attendance and your engagement and involvement. And I'm just sorry I can't, I don't know if I forgot to say, but I can't see or hear any of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you there from Jacqueline. And thank you very much to everyone for attending, and to Elena in the background.
Yes, thank you, Elena.
Technical support. So thank you very much, everybody. And
thanks, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.